and prioritizing this going forward. And so what we'll do today is I'm going to do a quick sort of run through of some information that a task force I'm involved with ITE has assembled just in the last couple of months, and a technical brief that's coming out. And then we're going to have Nathan join us, Nathan McNeil, who will be joining us today in the discussion. We're going to get into a little bit of discussion about this topic and sort of warm you all up. And hopefully we're going to give you at least 20 minutes or so of question and answer and dialogue and going back and forth. But before we get going too far, I thought it would be good. I know that there's really not that many people. I don't know how scared you are about introducing yourself online, but it's real simple. You can just, turn off the mute, turn on your screen, just say hello, who you are and where you're from, and just to help me understand a little bit about your life. About 3 weeks ago, we had this little event on a Monday that dropped 2 inches of snow. What did you do that day? So I can tell you what I did. I was in Baltimore. I went to the home opener of the Baltimore Orioles. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nathan, and then we'll go around the room real quick.
Great. Thanks, Randy, for having me, and looking forward to the discussion. My name is Nathan McNeil. I'm a research associate at the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. And I do a lot of research around travel behavior and safety with a focus on bicycle and pedestrian and transit. In terms of where I was during that unusual snowstorm, I was at home because, well, PPS was closed and my other son's daycare was closed. It was a little bit sloppy, not quite sledding weather. So we were, I feel like a lot of Lego building and other activities in the basement and in the house. So
well, great, Nathan. Thanks. Let's go. I'm going to go, since we've only got a few here, I'm going to go Kathy, Ken, Taylor, Nick, Russ, and Perrin in that order. And so you're all ready. So Kathy.
Yeah, hi all. I'm the transportation options specialist out on the coast, the northwest corner of Oregon. And amazingly enough, we actually had quite a bit of snow on the ground here where I live. A few miles up the road north of me, they had none. I've been working from home, and so I was working from home during that time, being amazed by the fact that there was snow on the ground that actually lasted past noon, which rarely happens. Never mind that it ever happens in April. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Ken?
Ken Renter, I'm a senior transportation planner with Washington County. On that day, I was juggling school schedules because Beaverton School District had a 2-hour delayed start that day. So that meant that what wasn't normally an overlap in terms of getting kids to school and starting work was an overlap. So I was juggling a couple of different things that day.
Great. Hey, Taylor, how about you?
Sorry, hi. I don't know my video turned on. Hi, I am Taylor. I work for Bike Portland. I'm not quite sure what this panel is going to be, but I definitely promote zero auto ownership, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And during the snowstorm, I was at the Yimby Town conference, so at PSU. So I took the bus because they couldn't really bike, but then it kind of melted by the end of the day. So I was back the next morning biking.
Great, thanks, Taylor. Hey, Nick, how about you?
Yeah, hi, Nick Hoda, he, him. I work at KPFF up here, so it's a civil engineering firm. Yeah, and I will, just like Kathy, I was working from home, so it wasn't really too exciting. I guess the one exciting thing is I usually go on a run in the morning, but I don't run in snow at all, so it's kind of like an excuse for me to use my wife's Peloton. So that's what I got to do. So
good call. A safe call.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Russ.
Hey everyone, my name is Russ Doubleday, he, him pronouns. I work at Kittleson and Associates. Nathan, it's good to see you. It's been a while. On the snow day a couple weeks ago, I think I was at home, so nothing special. I have vivid memories of taking my dog out for a walk, who usually enjoys the snow, and after a bit, he was just like, no, I'm not having this. I think he sort of mimicked the collective mood of this is a little weird in April. And then also trying to salvage somewhat successfully some tulips in and around the yard, since everything seems to be in bloom, and the heavy snow with the added weight of petals and things blossoming in it. There's still trees and branches down in the neighborhood where I am.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I've got the tulip thing in a big way. And actually this year, because of the cool weather, it's actually been a pretty good year for tulips. It's been actually pretty good.
Yeah.
Karen, how about you?
Hi, I'm Karen Faulkner. I'm an engineer at Tool Design, and similar to many people on the call, I think I was just working from home, so nothing too exciting on a snow day.
Great, thanks. Zeph?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Zeph Wagner. I'm a transportation planner at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Yeah, I was working from home and just got to look out my window and see it go from beautiful snow cover to completely melted and sunny by the end of the day.
It seems like normal spring around here. You just wait a
Yeah.
minute and the weather changes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Hello all. I'm Paul Dejo with KPFF. I'm a civil engineer here in Portland. And sorry, I missed the prompt, but
It's basically, what were you doing 3 weeks ago on Monday when the 2 inches of snow fell?
I was home and it was very fun. We got quite a bit out in Washington County where I'm at in Hillsborough, so it's enjoyable.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And what I'd like to do is sort of walk through some information that we've been working on, and the task force that I've been involved with started basically probably just before Christmas and produced a technical brief that'll be released pretty quickly. And some of that information that you see today will be in that brief, so you don't have to feel like you have to, jump on every slide that goes through. But what I'd like to do is sort of summarize some of the information and how we got to where we were relative to this topic. And the first thing we did was identify sort of a guiding principle for the group and some of the questions we wanted to explore, not the things that we did right out of the gate. And so we basically identified zero auto ownership has the potential to be one of the more positive impact lifestyle options related to climate change, congestion reduction, and healthy urban living. And that sort of drove the areas that we wanted to investigate more, to at least in the near term, after we did sort of some baselining work of, are we investing in transportation infrastructure in a balanced way that addresses the needs of all users? And are we doing the right things for zero auto ownership? And are we focusing upon the people that have these access needs and mobility needs, rather than just simply the modes when we're serving the communities? And then if we're investing, are we investing it proportional to the zero auto ownership households in the country or in our metropolitan areas? And then if we're investing and we're doing that, when we develop that, is it directed simply to, for example, car-free zero auto ownership, which have economic means to travel, versus those people that maybe disproportionately the money's going there instead of those that are car-less, that don't have the means and have been historically underrepresented. And so those were areas we wanted to explore, but to get to that, we wanted to understand more specifically about, what do we know about zero auto ownership from the very, information and people who live that every day. So let's start at the beginning. There's 280 million plus vehicles in the United States. And when you look at the whole of the United States, and the pie chart here basically represents the households in the United States by auto ownership, not quite 10%, just under 10% are zero auto ownership. And what does that look like across the United States? Well, there's certain areas where zero auto ownership is very substantial. For example, Washington, D.C., the states of New York and Massachusetts, driven primarily by New York City and Boston, the metropolitan areas. But when we look also at the other end of the spectrum, some of the areas where their highest auto ownership are places like Raleigh, North Carolina, Nashville, Riverside, California, Austin. Those are above what the nationwide trends are. We talked about 9% zero auto ownership. These are ones that would be lower than that. And Portland is on the basically sort of the low side also. And what that says is that there's really a good opportunity here for the exploration and growth and enhancement. The opportunity exists for zero auto ownership. So what do we know about it in a historical context? If you go back over 60 years, the census data plotted here in this line chart shows the change in zero auto ownership in the census in the last 60 years. And obviously this chart shows a declining starting, in the mid 20% back in 1960 down to our 9%. More recently, it's slightly increasing, not much, but it seems to be bottoming out. And maybe this is a unique time where we're able to evaluate circumstances and seize the opportunity for zero auto ownership. One of the things that we know historically over time is that income plays a role in zero auto ownership, but by no means is low income the only zero auto ownership income class. This data here in the bar chart shows about 60% of zero auto ownership is low income, and the other 40% are middle income and higher incomes, which again shows that there's a lot of room for potential decision making and priorities, but they can't be isolated in one sector or class. One of the things I think that maybe is an area where people mistake sometimes on zero auto ownership is, oh, that's a big city thing. That's only for the big cities. But the reality is zero auto ownership exists throughout the country. In rural areas, in small metropolitan areas, and this chart showing 250,000 people or 1 million people, those trends match the nationwide trend of about 8-9%. It's only in the largest metropolitan areas do you get that jump, a substantive increase in zero auto ownership, and more recently that has dropped off, and that's shown here in the chart in yellow as you go from the 1970s to the current conditions, where clearly we've seen a reduction in zero auto ownership, similar to what we had mentioned earlier. One of the other factors about who zero auto ownership is household size. This is research that was done in the Northeast Illinois area, the Chicago metro area. And in the chart in blue, it shows all households and the typical, number of persons in the household, 1, 2, 3. And in red, it shows the same kind of household distribution, but only for zero auto ownership. And clearly, the one-person households are overrepresented relative to the population. And so that's a clear area or group of folks that we would want to learn a lot more about. And all other categories, they're underrepresented. Those would obviously represent opportunities for growth. But clearly, learning more about those single households would teach us more about how their mobility needs can be best served. Age plays a key role too. As we get older, the propensity for greater zero auto ownership is there. This chart shows, again, census related data for age groups 50, 60, 70, and 80. And in blue, you see the pre-2010 data. And it increases pretty sharply in the retirement years, almost asymptotically going up. When you bring that more current census data, 2017 American Community Survey data, you can see there's a shifting going on, possibly the boomer era hanging onto their cars a little bit longer, but still a very asymptotic shift as aging occurs. So again, a group of people and a user group that we need to be very conscious of about how to best service them and what their needs are for mobility. When we look at zero auto ownership, what are the modes of travel they actually use? Well, there's actually been research done. Again, this was for the Chicago area, and it contrasts the typical modes for all households, shown in blue here, which are driver motor vehicle dominant, versus zero auto ownership, where walk trips are the #1 mode, followed by bus transit as the second mode. So once again, learning from folks that are zero auto ownership about what their modes are and what their travel patterns are, what the kinds of investment strategies and enhancements that can be made that would have a direct correlation to encouraging this opportunity there's some good clues in just the information that is out there. Equity is another area in zero auto ownership where there's really a great opportunity for more exploration, not just strictly using auto ownership and zero auto ownership as a tool, but digging a little deeper. For example, there's research work that has been done in looking at zero auto ownership for persons with disability. It's almost 4 times as more likely, whether they work or they don't work, to be zero auto ownership and disability. And so once again, we have a user group and a group of people of how we would service them and what their needs are and the types of things that we can invest in that might help them that we can think about. And obviously race is also another issue that's obviously talked about quite a bit when we talk about equity issues. Here is information, again, census information, and it shows zero auto ownership, the average about 9, white households about 7% below the average, and African American or Black households at about double the rate at 18, and many of the other different categories that are in the 11 and 12 and 14%. So once again, from an equity standpoint, there's really room for exploration and learning about how to best, most equitably invest public infrastructure dollars. A couple current trends, some of those associated with, let's say, transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft, and ride hailing. Research that's been done has indicated that households that are car-free, that are discretionary, are more prone or more likely to be zero auto ownership than the car-less households where economic considerations are already in play that affect that. And so again, that's a decision that would affect the types of investments that you might make that were private oriented versus public oriented. Car-free might be more private oriented. They can use their resources to access these if we can provide accommodation of space, curb space, and things to accommodate those needs. Whereas car-less, that's a different issue and a different group that would require different strategies. And then finally, relative to physical infrastructure and space, this plot shows a correlation between walk scores, bike scores, and transit scores averaged together for the 15 largest metropolitan areas in the United States and plot against their associated zero auto ownership. And there's a strong correlation between the relationship between the walk score, bike score, transit score average and zero auto ownership. It's increasing as the walk score, bike score goes up, zero auto ownership goes up. Again, providing good understanding about the types of investments and how those could be parlayed into creating opportunities for greater zero auto ownership. So that's a lot of information, but there's also some trends that are emerging, and some of them are emerging right away that influence zero auto ownership. Probably first and foremost, relative to autos, is their costs are increasing dramatically. In December, the average cost of a new car sale was $47,000. This plot shows from 1960s all the way to current, so for the last 60 years, the median household income plotted with the average new car sales cost, or the cost of a new car sale on average at the same correlated year. And back in the 1960s, the relationship of a new car as a percentage of median income was like about a third, and it's now doubled almost to 2/3 in that time frame. And what does that mean from a standpoint of investments and strategies? The opportunity is probably increasing for people considering zero auto ownership, and so good investments made properly will be well received, going forward with those trends increasing. And why is that increasing? Well, if you look at the trends on the right, electric and autonomous vehicles, the sales of those are projected to increase substantially. This trend shows from 2020 to 2030, the sale forecast for electric vehicles increasing almost asymptotically. Those vehicles have been traditionally and continuously much more expensive and would be contributing to those kinds of factors, again, leading to the potential for good investment in zero auto ownership having a productive outcome if strategies are developed and policies are developed properly today. A couple other areas related to zero auto ownership. one related to climate change. This shows NASA data from the 19th century to current and the increasing temperatures over time. And I think there's a lot of households that are thinking about, how to deal with that. And one of the things that falls into that is auto ownership, either reduced or zero auto ownership. And so once again, we're right at a point where there could be significant opportunities if strategies and policies and investments are appropriately placed. And then finally, one last one is, with the trends from work from home over the last couple decades, this showing the census data, they were pretty stable until the pandemic hit. And they substantially skyrocketed way high in 2020. And the forecast for those to settle down is not back to their pre-existing condition, but to a much higher level, possibly as high as 4 times what it was prior to the pandemic. It's not known exactly where that will land, but obviously opportunities to expand upon that and really build upon that in the future have tremendous potential for opportunities for zero auto ownership. And the artificial intelligence capabilities that would enhance that in the next decades and decades to come could play a very substantial role. So that leads to another logical question about where are these people? Who are they? And so we reached out with Metro, who has a substantial resource in GIS for the 4-county metro area, and we're able to basically fuse together census data relative to zero auto ownership. And this plot basically shows by census tracts in the metro area the greatest level of zero auto ownership in the region in the dark colors, and in the lighter colors the lesser amounts. And so when you were looking, if you looked at that, you look at the central business district and the central city area as a key area for opportunity in that regard. And it would be simple to really just look at those areas and say, okay, those are the areas where we can do really well, and we can invest there. But when you dive a little deeper into the information and fuse together other data sources in that work, if you look at the relationship for those zones with higher auto ownership, and this is just one that's in the Pearl District area, this shows a bicameral type distribution where you have substantially wealthy people probably buying condominiums that are very, $1 million condominiums that are probably car free, in the same area where you have a substantial population of very low incomes and unhoused people that would have very different needs and different policy requirements to service them and be effective in providing them opportunities at the same time. So with all that information, what we did as a group is identify some areas in the near term that we can go for further. We've gone through the baselining type discussion that'll be released here in the next month. But the next areas to look at, we identified 3 possible areas and types. And this is areas where we would like your help in discussions and learn a little bit more from you about areas where you think we can make some headway. First was potential to take zero auto ownership data and fuse it together in regional areas, and using data sets, different types of data sets, and fuse together to provide tools that aren't just nationwide or big metropolitan, but you can use them down at a project level, a day-to-day quarter level, or an area study where instead of waiting 10 years for a big regional plan to be done, we're dealing with it day-to-day on local level type transportation analysis. A second level was trying to figure out on an equity basis how you can more effectively utilize the information. And one of the areas was particularly in this area of public and private investment, and whether private investment should be steered in a certain direction, and whether public investment might be steered in a certain direction, and what would that do, and how would that encourage or enhance zero auto ownership. And then a third area is there historic practice about how we do our investments and our public investments and strategies in transportation, and how those have actually been applied to zero auto ownership, if they have at all. And if for example, there's a lot of modal strategies for vehicle or transit, and now for bike or walk, safe routes to school and things, do those actually target zero auto ownership in a productive, in an enhanced way, and in a way to encourage it and seek to grow it, or are they not? And how would that be? And so there's some definite areas for exploration and understanding that we're looking at. So with that, what I'd like to do is sort of transition the discussion a bit to bring Nathan into the dialogue and start some question and answer from that standpoint. So Nathan, I don't know, let me get this off the screen first of all. We can jump back. How you doing, Nathan?
I'm good. Yeah, that was a lot of information to digest there. And I really like the framing of thinking about the carless or versus the car free. And so the people who, you know, the car free being the people that have chosen not to have a car, and the car less being those that either can't afford or, you know, circumstances prevent them from being able to have a car. And so I really like that. I want to step back for a minute and, you know, think about how land use plays into this, because I think that it affects so many things about what trips people need to make, and kind of what the environment is like in which they do it. And it seems particularly important for thinking about the car less, perhaps more than the car free. And I say that because in the context of Portland, and I think a lot of other cities in the past 15 or 20 years, a lot of people have been pushed from city centers or more, you know, closer in neighborhoods to the urban, you know, farther out areas, urban fringes, or this, you know, the outer neighborhoods, and to places that are often less amenable to walking in terms of, you know, not having good walking or biking or transit facilities. Maybe destinations are further spread out, jobs are not as close. You know, I think there's a number of factors when you get out there. But I guess the question is, how do you start to address the mismatch of where the carless populations are being pushed to kind of what their options are? And is it about changing the built environment, or is it about trying to shift where population, you know, growth occurs?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there that are areas for a lot deeper dive. I think one is it would be very helpful to learn, and this probably, and again, I'm going to look at it analytically because, you know, I think there's information that can help us in that regard. Is if you looked at the census as the changes occurred in zero auto ownership over time, if you look at that, I believe there's probably a pattern. That was current data that we showed in Portland. I believe if you looked at it maybe over the last even 20 years, but it would be really interesting if you had it over 60, is, you know, where was it before? Where was it thriving? And then ask your question, you know, of why it was thriving, and then where did it move and why did it move? I think those are, I think, things that can be learned from the past, because it's not like that doesn't exist, but it was, and it was conducive for certain reasons. I think we can learn a lot from that. I think another is, you know, projecting forward is thinking about things about what the future of is, you know, what makes it conducive to live zero auto owner. And so, for example, one of those is investments that maybe aren't asphalt and concrete and light poles and traffic signals, but maybe it's fiber and communication and networking and, you know, laptops. I mean, I think we all learned in the very short order with the pandemic, or even with a snowstorm for that matter, you know, being able to work remotely requires certain things. And when you talk about the car free people, they probably have those things. When you talk about the car less, they probably don't. And the jobs that they're probably taking may not require that. Well, how can, if they actually had the opportunity because they had the technology and the knowledge, would they be afforded those opportunities and could continue to live car free going into the future rather than feel compelled to not? And I just think, again, there's a lot of questions, you know, about things that aren't traditional. You know, they're not sidewalk, concrete, light rail investments that we could think about if we really focus around, hey, the goal here is, can we create an environment where zero auto ownership can thrive, where it can really be enhanced and encouraged? And, you know, when somebody who decides to do that and they got their pet at 3 a.m. that needs to go to a pet hospital, that's a real deal, right? You got to get the pet, you got to get help, or your child, you got to get medical care. And I think that paints that picture of the land use. And so if we understand more about what those needs are, then where the kinds of land uses could be placed constructively with the enhancements, the sidewalks, obviously walk was the number one mode. So we can accommodate that with walk trips and emphasize that where those walk trips would be meaningful. That strategy would make a lot more sense. And I'll use as a Portland example, River Terrace out by Mountainside High in Beaverton. You can build all the sidewalks and all the stuff you want, but you are so far away from a clinic, from a pet hospital, pretty much anything. So you're spending all the money on all the good stuff, but it's actually being placed in a place where it can't really thrive and particularly in the near term, maybe 20 or 50, maybe with artificial intelligence, this won't matter. I don't know. But the reality is, in the near term, could we make those investments a little bit more thoughtfully? And I think that's part of the exploration.
Well, and I like the idea of, can those sorts of investments make virtual working more possible for a greater segment of the population? And I wonder if there are other, do you have any thoughts on kind of other jobs tend to be, have gotten more dispersed in recent years, not necessarily as focused on central urban areas. And so maybe, are there changes with the transit system, the hub and spoke approach that maybe needs to be rethought or?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to learn that. I don't know that we know that per se. What you can see happening, and using a local example with Beaverton, there's a lot going on, their downtown area with greater housing, with greater services near where the services already are in a lot of cases. I think those afford opportunities, and I think Metro's planning with town centers and regional centers is well suited towards that. I don't know that we've gotten to the full breadth of bringing in this concept of zero auto ownership with it as to what you would do. Definitely the idea that, and I'll use, we'll use Boston as an example in the transit system. A lot of it is central business district focused, right? It's all radial sort of going in. Maybe that's not how it's going to be. So we got to be ready. And when we were talking about autonomous vehicles, maybe, if there's been talk of, oh my gosh, there's going to be tons of cars on the road and they're all going around looking, maybe the opposite actually occurs, is that it's optimized to meet the needs of folks. And if we can conduct a lot of business and commerce and things from home, that doesn't mean that we don't get to travel or whatever, but when we do it strategically and purposefully, rather than just, I gotta go get another widget from Home Depot. I gotta go get my kids from soccer. I've got to go, and all of a sudden you're generating all these vehicle trips that frankly are pretty tough to replicate with transit. They're easier to replicate actually with walk trips, frankly, if they're close enough. I mean, going to the park with the kids in a soccer match or going to the grocery store, some of those trips can be. It's just a matter of making sure you get the full breadth, the full spectrum of trips. You don't leave something out that makes it up. I can't be zero auto ownership because you left out a big pie slice of what my needs are on a daily basis.
So as I mentioned earlier on, I tend to study travel behavior and kind of the things that motivate people to choose one mode or another, or maybe to choose to not have a car if that's a choice. And one of the things that we tend to think about in affecting people's behavior or the levers that government has are kind of the carrots and sticks. So what are the incentives that you can offer, or I don't want to say the punishments, but the disincentives. And so in this case, the carrots being helping people afford different modes, helping or making those modes more available. The sticks being increasing costs associated with, say, driving, parking, gas, those sorts of things. I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on kind of the efficacy and political viability of both of those, but really on the stick side of things, like how much can we use the disincentive side of the equation to affect behavior?
I think those are red hot irons in the fire, political type topics, right? Because you're trying to make people do things they don't want to do. I think when you look at the data, when we were looking at the vehicle costs, some of that naturally is just going to happen. I mean, $47,000. I don't know about you all. I don't buy a car that I wouldn't buy a car that. I'd say no. In fact, we're looking to get rid of a car now,
Yeah.
and because of that. And so some of that I think is going to happen because of the technology and safety requirements. If we go Vision Zero, we're putting a lot of requirements on the vehicle to do things, and the move to autonomous vehicles is probably going to lead towards that kind of cost equation naturally in the market. And I think the key thing isn't the stick of, oh gosh, it's going to be more expensive to own a car. I think it's the opportunity that's happening, whether we like it or not. The electric vehicle is going to happen, whether we like it or not. It's going to be more expensive. And the reality is people need a choice when they say, gosh, no, I don't really, what's the best carrot? Well, the best carrot is not paying for insurance, not paying for that car, not paying for maintenance, not paying gas tax, not paying a whole bunch of things that you didn't need anything to do with, frankly. Yeah. And so I think some of that will happen naturally because we have some things in motion right now. It's just a matter of, do we have the strategies in place? Do we have the right strategies to take advantage of that and not let it just, what you see in that trend of zero auto ownership from 1960s is, gosh, in the 60s, you had a pretty substantial zero auto ownership. What did we do? Obviously, we did something that discouraged it mightily, right? And we didn't take advantage of what we had. We had it and we didn't even know we had it, I guess. And so now we're in a situation of, okay, how could we get back to where we were, right? And I don't know that it's going to be, I don't think stick base is going to get it. I think creating opportunities where people can naturally make those choices on their own. And I think, the work from home, hey, if you went to most workplaces in 2015 and said, we're going to have all our staff work from home, most managers would have gone, they would have been, they'd go nuts. Yeah. You can't do that. And we've proven we can, right? So I think there's some barriers like that are unknown right now that are ahead of us that we're going to have to work. And hopefully they're not the barriers of negative stuff. I think in the case, the pandemic was negative, but I've got to say the work from home changes are really positive things that happen not in pandemic's terrible, but we're pretty clever, frankly. We had a bunch of technology that was there that we didn't know we really could use. Yeah. And I think it's afforded an opportunity to really grow zero auto ownership right now, not 10 years from now, because I think we'll miss the opportunity. If a bunch of managers say, oh, well, let's just all get back in the office. It's like, why do we need to do that? Yeah. So some of that is maybe there's an incentive from a cost standpoint. You don't have to pay rent for the office and you don't have to do a bunch of things. You can keep your cost equations down. Again, the incentives might be, we can conduct our business, make money and not do that. And now we get the outcome that we want on this other side that's productive. I don't know. But I definitely think if we go stick only, you look at some of the policies we're talking about, it's not like they weren't known in the 70s, and yet they did take sort of a stick approach and they really accomplished very little. So I think we really have to look at it from the opportunity standpoint of how to help folks, particularly, I would say, if it's public policy and public investment, the car less people. I don't know that we put enough emphasis on who are these people and how do we help them conduct their lives and their business in a way that gives them opportunity, affords them opportunity. I think we politically throw money or say, hey, look at this, project we did for you. And it's like, I don't know that you really help these folks. Yeah. And I think if we can do that, I think we can make some real good impact.
Well, and so speaking of the kind of the disruption that the pandemic did bring about, and the fact that to date, many offices have not, or many businesses have not required that people return to the office, and some have, or some, some have pared down the amount of office space that they have. But it brings me back to that the chart that you showed of the Pearl District and the kind of the population by income, and that dichotomy between the very low income and, and I would assume that a lot of those may be the houseless population.
Yeah, the unhoused.
And I guess I'm wondering, is there an opportunity there to think about, like, do you start to convert some of that office space to housing for this population that is, that they don't have cars, or they don't tend to, and are maybe primed to be a car-free population.
Right.
I'm curious for your thoughts on the opportunity there, and how you'd go about kind of pushing that.
There's opportunity there, but the part that's tough is, figuring out the financial piece of it. Obviously, the concept of providing downtown housing, because that's closer to work in the Pearl District. Again, you go back to the year 2000 and you walk through the Pearl, it didn't look like it looks today, right? But yet those houses are $1 million, right? Or not all of them, but a lot of them are very, very, very expensive, and they are on that other side of that distribution. And so if you were to convert office to housing, how would you be able to do that in a way that you could, accommodate people? You have to figure this out. And I'm not saying we can't. I just think you got to go in starting with okay, how does this pencil? What's the pro forma? What do we do? And we got a big issue, obviously, with the unhoused that is not being serviced well. And I don't know that we're getting the right outcomes right now. I think there's, again, a huge opportunity that maybe you can lift a lot of folks from that in creating opportunities if they don't have to be in a car to go get the next job. If they're in that mode, the unhoused is, again, talking about spectrum. There's a big spectrum of unhoused, but clearly, how could you accomplish that? And I'm sure there's people smarter than me thinking about these things, I would hope. But the reality is, I think that is an area, and it seems to be, there's an area where, when you look at Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, out in the outer areas, the suburban areas, you don't see it as much as you do in the urban areas. So that, you can view that as a problem or an opportunity. Well, if that's where it is, maybe we can create the opportunity to service that better in the urban areas than we have in the past. What that is, that's why we got all these people in the room today. They can help us.
And I guess I would want to point out, if anybody wants to participate, if you have any ideas or answers to our questions.
Yeah, if any of the questions have spurred any thoughts, we can go around the room real quickly, and you can pass. I don't want to make it, I don't want to threaten anybody, but we've got a small group here, so with less than a dozen folks. Why don't we just do a quick around the room? What are your perspectives on how we could enhance, how we could encourage, how we could prioritize zero auto ownership? From your perspective, is there something that we're all missing, that we could do that would help that? So, and I'm not doing this alphabetic or anything. I'm just doing it by what's on my little Brady board bunch here. So I've got Allison, Paul, Perrin, and Russ. We'll go sort of in that order, and you can easily pass. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. But clearly, if you've got some thoughts, please share them with the group.
Sure. I joined this talk late, so I don't have a full picture of what you mentioned, but it was interesting to me to hear that you thought that, maybe I'm not getting this the right way, but that car ownership would go back up, or that there was risk to it with return to office. I've been working remotely for 2 years and without a car for 15 or I don't know, my whole life, basically, except for 1 year and when I was 18. But I've actually been considering buying a car now that I've been full-time remote to get out of town more. And going back to work was not really a consideration in buying a car. So it's just kind of my perspective and car buying as someone who's been without a car for a very long period of time and is thinking about purchasing one.
Wow. Interesting. Thanks,
it's also really hard for me to buy a car. They're very hard to get right now. They're very expensive, so that's been delaying my interest in
I can
actually
imagine.
getting one.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's at 47,000 on the average sale of a new car. That's an eye opener.
Yeah, that's probably the main thing that's stopping me right now from buying a car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
I was
Paul,
just
what if
gonna-
when we go to, or oh, go ahead, Zeph.
I was just gonna add it, by the way. Hi, Allison.
Hey,
Um,
Zeph, what's up?
Good to see you. Just to back up what Allison was saying, working from home is exactly what drove me to buy a car after 13 years of not having a car, for the same reason. It was like, because I was stuck at home all the time, it created a feeling of like wanting to get out of town and go on hikes and things like that, more easily. But also, transit went from something that I just would use all the time to something that I was, afraid to use during, especially the first year of COVID. So,
Right.
yeah, I think those two things combined had a big
And I
impact.
wonder-
And I worry that the effect on people's being comfortable with transit might linger for quite a while.
That's a
once
great
people
point.
are out of the habit.
Yeah,
Great
that is a
point.
great point. And I also wonder the degree to which, I know some people are leaving cities because they can work remotely and not have to pay the cost of living in a city. And that is something that remote work could change travel behaviors there as well.
So I'm curious as to why Allison and Zeph wouldn't want to maybe use one of the car share programs.
It's possible. I've definitely looked into it, especially because there's a new one that's just come to Portland to replace Car2Go or whatever we lost a couple of years ago. It's actually quite expensive, and then the alternative is renting a car. I borrow a car quite a bit right now, and honestly, like car sharing with my friends and roommates is my preferred solution, but it's less reliable.
Yeah, for me, I bought my car in 2020 and Car2Go and Reach Now had both shut down, which really was a huge factor for me. And Zipcar also raised their prices quite a bit. I used to use Zipcar once a month to just like run some errands or do some stuff. And it became so expensive that the monthly cost of a car was less than what I was spending on Zipcar. So to me, one of the biggest things that would encourage zero car ownership for myself, but I think for a lot of others in cities like Portland would be to have something like Car2Go, but maybe a publicly subsidized one so that it covers the entire city and is more affordable. Because I found that would make it so that I would like walk to the grocery store, but if I accidentally bought way too much stuff, I could always find a Car2Go nearby. And
those short-term trips seem like more reasonable for car sharing. Like if I'm just trying to get out of town for like a weekend or, even just a long day hike in the gorge, those don't seem like financially the best options.
I would pipe in here to say, I think this is an area where looking at the difference between the car free and the car less is important insofar as many people who choose to be car free can afford to use these services and the short term or things like ride hail, which can make a big difference in Zeph's sort of example there. But if you're carless and the cost of that car share or that ride hail is too much, then you might not make that trip. And so, yeah, making those things affordable is a big factor here.
Yeah, I would love to see something sort of like Bike Town where maybe low income people get discounted rate, higher income people pay more. But it has to be publicly subsidized because these private companies, they get a bunch of venture capital funding, they exist for a while and then they fail. And like no transportation service seems to survive without subsidies. So I think that's a big factor. Yeah, and speaking of Bike Town, I think that I think expanding that with electric bikes would probably do a lot to convince people to become car free as well.
The e-bike opportunities, I think, in the next 5 and 10 years, if you look back 5 or 10 years and you look forward 5 or 10 years, I think they're going to look a lot different. in 10 years when we look back at where we are today to where we're going to be. I don't think it's going to look anything like 2010 at all. And I think that a lot of that is possibly going to be driven by the $47,000 car and a $2,000 electric bike on the low end. I think that affords a completely different perspective of, mobility and access. Let's go. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Someone else. I can
go right ahead.
Okay, I guess it's kind of interesting. I don't know. I feel a little bit disappointed because I think that something that I feel really strongly about is, since I don't have a car anymore, the feeling of freedom that I have is actually a lot stronger. Like I mean, and to be fair, I guess I was never the kind of person who was going on trips a lot, but like I kind of had to be honest with myself. Like, should I really be dragging this car around because I want to go to the coast like once a month max? Because that's like, and then if I do, honestly, it's more special and I don't feel bad driving all the way over there. It's kind of, and then there's also, in my opinion, in addition to promoting car share, which I do think is important and will ultimately, like, I don't know, I think that communal car ownership is also probably the best way to go. But what about, first of all, I don't know, I mean, like more urban hiking and camping, places you can get to. I mean, I don't know, like, I'm not trying to be combative here or anything, but for me, it's worth not having a car and just going to Mount Tabor. Or buses that go out to natural areas, and for planned day trips, or skiing is a really important thing because I love to ski and it's hard to get out there without a car. I was like on a Facebook group of carpooling, and that's kind of what I tried to use, but there are buses that go out there, and I think that people would use them more if you were disincentivized to park, drive. You're not incentivized because the traffic getting out to places is so bad. So I would just think about more creative alternative. Yeah. And I think that it's sad that car ownership is seen as kind of, ultimately, even for people who know kind of the downsides to it, it's still seen as kind of the ultimate way to have freedom. And in my understanding, that's not my experience. So sorry, I just talked for too long.
Oh, no, that was great. Actually, you hit on a resonant chord that I have, is when you're thinking about zero auto ownership, of how do you get folks to the things they need or want or inherently, viscerally want to do, right? And so if they want to go to the gorge and hike, and they want to go to Mount Hood and ski, and the only way to do that is own a car, well, that doesn't seem very equitable. And so, again, that kind of thinking is just what we want to do. I mean, we want to think this through to those pieces of the puzzle so that you can create the environment where, if you were zero auto ownership, you could feel the experience of freedom. You wouldn't feel trapped. You wouldn't feel like, with work from home and pandemic, you're stuck. And so these are the kinds of thinking, this kind of discussion, I think, really elevates things. Henry?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. It's weird being a street trust person and commenting on the discussion, but I really like this conversation. I did want to point out what Hami just said in the chat, trains and intercity bikeways. I think those are two great opportunities, especially intercity bikeways. I think a lot of folks in the Pacific Northwest generally, when we think of renting a car or borrowing a car to get out and do something on the weekend or whatever, we're trying to get out to do something active, in the gorge or on the Oregon coast. And there are things that we could probably bike to, especially with e-bikes, and like an e-bike share that is actually regional, that could totally address that. Unfortunately, there are some trails in the region that people can use to get to some places, but I think that network needs to be greatly improved. And I think the Street Trust is on that case. I'll let you know.
No, Henry, I think you hit I'll use as an example, just an event of, gosh, could we have done this better, is the eclipse. When we had the eclipse, it was just outside the border of the city of Portland and the Portland metro area, just south of Wilsonville. And yet, how many crossings do we have? How many? I ended up in St. Paul for it, which was just over the border. But how could you have gotten there on a bike? It was so accessible. If we had just built the ability to do those kinds of trips and had a network that did that, it would be, there's an opportunity, an investment strategy, a reason to spend money, and then do it in a way that over the next 20 years, we get value for it in return. It's a great point, really great point. Nick, you've got a comment?
Yeah, and it kind of spills over into, I think, other topics that we've had, and something that I think about. I mean, I live car free. I mean, I can afford to have a car if I wanted to, but the thing that kind of, I guess, pushed me in kind of living in this kind of situation is that, like home ownership is really like this like key for so many people in our generation to like make a living and be able to have this goose egg, and that home ownership is really like structured in these kind of like car based areas and regions and how we even construct like American cities and societies. So it's really hard for like, people like, in my generation, and we're fortunate enough to be able to buy a house and be in a place that we can live car free, but those are always at odds. And I find people in my generation are always kind of having to like conflict with this car free lifestyle, or choosing to get a down payment down on a house and kind of live that life to actually have that goose egg. And it's just because I don't know, it's rooted in a lot of structures and a lot of things that we can unpack, but
Yeah.
that's what I'm always thinking about as part of these kinds of conversations that don't get talked about enough, I think.
Well, and Nick, I think that's a really great point. And I'll use Portland on the east side as a great example, where there's really conducive flat network streets for biking that make it, that housing stock is very conducive to zero auto ownership. When you put yourself out in Forest Grove, or I don't mean to be bad about it. Don't take this as negative or something, but you're so totally remote that, to get to services that it's hard. That's a different investment strategy, right? And so, but the interesting thing is that there's zero auto ownership in both places. And so, how do we take advantage of that? It's not like at the expense of one, it's got to be together, is create those opportunities in each of those communities. Honey, you've got a thought?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Hami. I don't know if y'all talked about aesthetics at all. I came in late as well into the conversation, but I focus heavily on the aesthetics of our infrastructure, of our streets, of our neighborhoods. I think we focus way too little on that kind of stuff. So I don't foresee people getting out of their cars and being car less or car free if the streets continue to be hostile like they are, with the loud noises, smells, frankly, danger of walking across the street. It's much more dangerous to walk than bike in this city. And I say that from my own experiences, and I think it's borne out through the data. So I think we need to create spaces that are welcoming to humans, that have lots of benches, that have lots of kind of interactivity. When I go to places like Scandinavian countries, places in Japan, there's a lot of sense of belonging in the street, which is what I like to call our sacred public spaces. And I just think we don't prioritize it. We always talk about money and how we don't have enough of it. I think the problem really is we don't prioritize our public spaces. We do have the money. We're richest country in the world. So I really think we should focus on that and create our those kinds of spaces. Thank you for letting me.
No,
talk.
it's a very great point. And I think you're totally right. If people don't feel comfortable in that, using the walk, number one mode is walk, right? But if you don't feel comfortable walking, how are you going to walk, right? And so thinking, again, these discussions are great because it makes you think about what can we do to get at the core of what makes that happen. I think, Taylor, you had your hand up for a second. I don't know if that was.
Well, I realize we were running out of time or over time now. So
It's okay. We
I
have
can-
time for you.
Well, no, it's all right. But this has been really interesting discussion, so I appreciate it. I feel like, I think about this stuff a lot, and it's kind of hard.
Mhm.
I've been struggling finding this data, so I'm first of all appreciative of you putting this up here. I think that there's some idea, yeah, like I'm saying, I guess we just need to kind of shift a little bit from this idea that not owning a car, especially in a place that's has, comparatively pretty good public transit and access for other modes of transportation, is like kind of you feel bad for that person. Like you don't have a car, like you want one though, right? Like it's always you're aspiring for one, or that everyone who can't afford a car is wanting one too, even though that may not be the case. They might want better public transportation in their area. They might want a car because right now they feel like that would help them a lot, and it probably would, but they'd ultimately be happy not to be saddled with that extra cost. So there's other things we can do to improve people's lives.
Yeah, no, great point. And again, carrot stick, I would much rather be encouraging people, be going, way to go, you're living without a car. My son is doing it in San Francisco, and it's like, way to go. Instead of, oh gosh, I feel sorry for you. I mean, how do you?
It's important to recognize that it is a burden still, right?
It is a burden. Well, it is. It's not
it.
easy, and that's the whole point. Is if we get into the context of the people and what they experience, and like I said, I'll use a simple thing like your pet's sick, your dog's sick, and you need to get your dog to help, and you don't want to feel like, because of the choices I made, that my dog died. That would be terrible. That'd be an awful feeling. And yet I don't know that it sounds like we're talking about small things, but if you dive in deep enough, I think you can unpack this enough to start building the components to really build a robust, real positive environment for folks. And I don't think it's that hard. $1.2 trillion are being spent on the transportation investment bill, and obviously that's across the country and it spreads like peanut butter. But if we spend, every time we spend money, we think about these things, we'll get better. We definitely will. So, hey, I know we're running at a short of time. This has been a great conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I know for those that are out there that are listening to us in the virtual world, great. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank each of you, and thank you for supporting the Street Trust through this whole session. This has been a really great conference, and I want to thank them for the opportunity today. So, Henry, I don't know if you have anything to close this up with today.
I'm so sorry to cut this conversation short because this is so amazing. So thanks everyone for being here. I do have a sign out thing that I should say. Thank you.
Should I put just to flash it on the screen for the folks afterwards? I've got Nathan and Mai's email. I can pop that on the screen real quickly just so it's recorded.
Yeah.
Let's go find that. Give me a second, but you can keep going while I write that down.
Thank you to Rainey and Nathan. Thank you to our sponsors listed on the conference website, and thank y'all for coming. As you leave this